Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth in our series of 8 weekly webinars brought to you by one of IFAI's partner organizations, North Carolina State University's Wilson College of Textiles. Today's webinar is titled Classifications and Testing Requirements for PPE in Medical Environments and Personal Use. My name is Aaron Monson. I'm the Education and Events Manager here at IFAI, and I'll be helping to host today's session. I'm joined by the IFAI team, Janelle Wells-Berkeley, Megan Furl, and Annie Castle. Also assisting with today's webinar is Melissa Sharp, Associate Director of the Zeiss Textiles Extension at the Wilson College of Textiles. Huge thank you to Melissa for supporting the development and execution of these weekly webinars. And we're equally indebted to our association sponsors, SEAMS, the Association and Voice of the U.S. Sewn Products Industry, ICP, Association Connecting Electronics Industries, and STISA, the Sewn Products Equipment and Suppliers of the Americas. In today's session, you'll learn about the various classifications of PPE and the tests required for each level. FDA and NIOSH testing will be covered for gowns, face masks, respirators, and coveralls, as well as recommended testing for general purpose face coverings. And we are so pleased to have everyone with us today. Thank you for bearing with us. We're all working remotely, and we hope you will forgive us for any technical challenges that may unexpectedly occur. You'll have the opportunity to submit text questions by typing them into the questions box of your webinar control panel. You can send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll address them at the end of the webinar. Also today, a PDF version of the slides, the PowerPoint slides, are available to you in the handouts portion of your webinar toolbar. Today's webinar content is provided by Emil Den Hartog, Director of Graduate Programs, TECS, and Associate Director of TPAC, and Martin King, Professor, TECS at the Wilson College of Textiles at North Carolina State University. With this, I will now turn things over to Emil and Martin to get things going.
Thank you very much, Aaron, for the nice introduction. We have split the work today on these topics, talking about medical environments, personal protective equipment products, in a topic about and around masks, as well as surgical gowns and medical gowns. Before I continue, I would like to give my colleague, Dr. Martin King, a moment to introduce himself. Martin?
Thank you, Emil. This is Martin King, and for the last 20 years, I've been a professor of biotextiles as well as textile technology at the Wilson College of Textiles here in North Carolina State University. And so I'm very pleased to be here to participate as in order to develop new programs in medical textiles. But in addition, I have other appointments which may or may not be of interest to you. One is a chaired professor at Donghua University in Shanghai, China, and I actually will be presenting some projects and summer schools there next month, remotely, of course. And also I'm an adjunct professor of surgery at Laval University in Quebec City in Canada, and also in Manitoba. So I do cover medical textiles from a variety of points of view, and we're very pleased that you're able to join us for this specific webinar this afternoon. So thank you.
Thank you, Martin. As mentioned, my name is Emil Den Hartog, and Aaron already mentioned a few of my affiliations, and I think as many of you may not be that familiar with it, the Textile Protection and Comfort Center is a full service center for the textile industry to evaluate textiles, fabrics, as well as end products on protection and comfort, where we help industry with new developments and understand tests and test methods as they relate to human protection as well as human comfort. I teach classes in textile testing as well as clothing physiology. And I think that combined background is probably why we were asked to give this seminar. Today, you will just have a generic introduction into the requirements and specifications and standards that exist. The next 2 weeks will be more in depth around next week respiratory protective testing and evaluation and products. And in 2 weeks from now, Dr. King will again be back with you to talk more about specific medical textile development, product development, and topics like that. So we may defer some questions that are more specific around manufacturing to those webinars. So with that, let me start with the contents that we drafted today, mostly around medical masks and gowns, relevant standards and requirements. Let me move this. So when we talk about masks, we will go through the different types of face masks that are out there for the medical community and a little bit about the non-medical masks, and then the same for gowns and drapes in medical textiles, where Dr. King will take over. So when we focus on masks and gowns, one thing that you need to know and get familiar with it if you want to enter those markets is the FDA classification processes. Masks and gowns are mostly so-called FDA Class 2 products, which means they are subject to 510K regulations. The 510K from the Food and Drug Cosmetics Act requires manufacturers to submit a pre-market notification, the so-called 510K. It is mentioned that it takes at least 90 days to process, so it needs to be done 90 days prior to entering the market. And the challenge for the FDA process is that you need to demonstrate substantially equivalency to currently marketed products, which means if you want to do a surgical mask or a surgical gown, you need to show equivalency to current products out there. If you were to develop a completely new product, you would need to figure out for yourself what that equivalency could be, and that may sometimes be the challenge. As we're today focused on masks and gowns, pretty much there are some rules and guidelines and current products you can find, so that should not be the biggest burden. The whole objective of that regulation is to show that the new product or the new device is as safe and effective as legally marketed devices, which means products that are currently on the market. The last sentence is something there that I doubt it would ever be really relevant for gowns and masks, but maybe in the future, if whole entirely new technologies would come up, clinical investigations might need to be required if there's completely new things being developed. So focusing on masks, we need to step it down because there's an added level of complexity there that is, if you're not familiar with the field, sometimes challenging to understand why and how that has developed. I will not go into the entire history on how these things have developed. That is probably something for another time or another day. But there is a difference in general medical products, medical masks that are used in the hospitals, and specific products that are used for respiratory protection. Any product that is claiming to have any level of respiratory protection is regulated by NIOSH. NPPTL, the National Personal Protective Technologies Lab in Pittsburgh, is a technical laboratory under NIOSH. NIOSH is part of the CDC, but that is a separate lab set up to do certification of respirator testing. They test any type of respirator products from SCBA, what you might see in first responders and firefighters, respiratory protective devices that are used by miners or people working in asbestos cleaning in the energy, but also the N95 respirators that are used in the medical environments. So whenever people in a hospital, but also first responders are in an area where they are required to have respiratory protection because there is a threat to their respiratory system, they must have N95 certified products. Obviously, with the current shortages, that can be a challenge, but that is the minimum requirement that is needed for someone to really meet that law. The other part of the discussion is around surgical and medical masks, and there's not a huge difference in there. I will go into some of the classifications there at the end. These surgical and medical masks are used in a hospital, but they are not meant to provide respiratory protection per se. They are medical devices and as such regulated by the FDA pre-market notification that I just mentioned, the 510K. As they are not primary respiratory protective devices, they are not regulated by NIOSH but by FDA. These are subject to different standards and testing methods that I will go into as well. The final part that I will touch on very briefly is anything outside of this domain that does not claim to have a medical purpose or a respiratory protective purpose could be considered a homemade, DIY, or general purpose mask. These are currently not regulated other than the very generic textile requirements that any textile sold in the US might have. So one thing to start out with might be the difference between the N95 and a surgical mask, because that always generates many questions. N95s are tested and approved by NIOSH and under regulation 42 CFR Part 84, as you see. The graph on the right is actually can be downloaded from the CDC NIOSH website if you search for that. And I think one of the really important things here are the third and the fourth point. The N95 respirators, as they need to have respiratory protection, are tested for face seal, fit, and have fit testing requirements. The user needs to perform a seal check prior to using it. It's not just about filtration of the fabric or the base material, but it is also about how the entire product fits the nose and face and mouth and close it up from the environment to have an effective seal from the environment, because that has been shown to be the biggest problem for good quality filtration fabric to provide any type of protection to users. Surgical masks have some filtration testing that they need to undergo, and as I mentioned, I will go into detail a little later, but they do not have that requirement for face seal fit, and therefore are not considered respiratory protective products. They do have pretty strict requirements on liquid repellency, depending on the classification. The surgical and isolation masks really have a liquid repellency requirement that is pretty strict, and that is something specific for those medical masks that may also not be necessary for general purpose masks. So again, the difference is respirator versus a fluid splash, protection device. These masks are primarily used to try to contain some of the sputum produced by wearers, as well as if patients that are unconscious and are expelling bodily fluids that may be expelled from their body with force, and when nurses and surgeons, etc., need to be close to them, that gives them some initial splash protection. But as mentioned, the certification processes for these two different types of products is entirely different. Surgical masks under FDA, N95s under NIOSH. So the N95s regulated by NIOSH, Code of Federal Regulations 42 Part 84. The idea here is not only that the requirements are different, but the process itself is also somewhat different. Prior to sending your products to NIOSH, you need to build your dossier that shows that you have done your initial evaluations, your due diligence, if you will. But the certification itself is conducted by the NPPTL lab under NIOSH, follows the NIOSH requirements, and it does the certification testing at that lab, and will send, of course, you will share you the results, and they will hand out a certificate that you meet the N95 requirements, and you will get on the safe equipment use list after a while that shows that your product meets the certifications. A lot of it is also associated with good manufacturing practices to make sure that not only the 20 devices you send to NPPTL meet the requirements, but your whole production does. So there's extensive requirements not only on the testing, but also on the production process and the manufacturing process, although that might be pretty similar to the FDA, what the FDA process requires from you. So if we go to some of the requirements, and I tried to summarize the highlights here. N95, if you see the first set of bullets, you see their NPR95 filters. There are actually 3 levels, N95, N99, and N100, that have demonstrated different filtration efficiency levels for the fabric as well as the end product. The N100 has a very high filter efficiency. It's never 100 because it's kind of philosophically, scientifically not possible to achieve. So it's 99.97%. The N, the P, and the R. P and R products stand for limited oil repellency functionality that these filters may also have. The N95, N99, N100 do not have that oil repellency requirement. The P have a partial requirement, and the R are oil resistant. So that is usually for different types of environments than a medical environment. Obviously, as we always say in textile protection and comfort sciences, it is not necessarily hard to protect people or to provide sufficient levels of protection. However, when we provide the respirator to someone, we also want to make sure that people can still breathe. So obviously, in addition to the filtration requirements, there are requirements that make sure that people can actually breathe through those products also when they are fitted to the face. So that's where the airflow resistance tests come in. They are different from the standard ASTM and EN and ISO tests that are currently done. It is possible to translate these numbers back and forth, but the test is pretty much done on the complete respirator with an airflow of 85 liters per minute. There are separate procedures where they actually a true human airflow is also simulated, but the essence is 85 liters per minute airflow, and the inhalation and exhalation resistance when that flow is being used shall not exceed 35 millimeters water column pressure or 25 milliliters water column pressure, as mentioned there, respectively, which would equivalent to 350 and 250 Pascal. The N95 respirators, as we use them, fall under the classification of non-powered air purifying particulate filters. If you go to the NPPTL website, you will see a large list of different types of respirator devices: powered, non-powered, air purifying respirators, self-contained breathing apparatus, the SCBA that the firefighters are using when they go into buildings. But this is a subset of all those classifications. The filters are tested. As you see here, 20 products are being evaluated for filter efficiency. A sodium chloride particulate test is done. The second one, the dioptyl phthalate test, is for the oil repellency characteristic. So that would only apply to the R and P series, the R95s and P95s. N95s only need to meet the first requirement of sodium chloride particulate filtration. Pretty much it's tested with a continuous airflow rate, and the filter efficiency has these requirements. If you go into, I subtracted the highlights here. If you go into documentation, I've added some links for you to survey further down this presentation, so you can explore these documents that are quite long and extensive, give you all the detailed information you need, but it provides the temperature, humidity, the concentration level for this sodium chloride particle test, as well as the DOP oil resistance tests. And then the size distribution is also very narrowly specified, 0.075 micron with the geometric deviation, roughly leading to a size range of 0.05 to 0.4 micron or 50 to 400 nanometers. That is I get questions regularly why these numbers are chosen. It is a combination of the challenges that are realistic for many environments, medical as well as other types of environments, as well as something that I think last week was explained by Steve Sharp of the most penetrating particle size, which is usually around 0.3 micron for most filters. So it is not only looking at sizes of bacteria and viruses and small particles that might be detrimental to human health, but it's also looking at the most relevant particle filters where they are having the hardest technical challenges to deal with these sizes, and that would typically be in this range. So that term of most penetrating particle size, which is usually around 0.3 micron, is also in this range. If you go to the European standards, they specifically call out 0.3 micron for that same reason. It's relevant for the challenges that people need to face, but it's also relevant for the type of products, technical fabrics that we are testing here. The DOP aerosol is oil repellency, so it has a different dimension. It has also have a different purpose, as I mentioned before, specifically for oil repellency. In addition to that, as I mentioned, an important aspect of the N95s is the fit testing. They have been done in the past, and also at the NPPTL lab does that on a human head form, but the real requirement is that a set of humans has to be individually fit tested prior to certification, but also prior to use. So there's an extensive procedure at the NPPTL lab of NIOSH, but also each hospital, when donning, which means putting on an N95 mask, need to be individually fit tested to make sure it achieves the ideal fit. So these saccharine and Victrix solution tests are procedures that people do that in-house in the hospitals, and that is because fit is extremely important to achieve respiratory protection, to protect the wearer from the environment. Leakage has very often shown to be the biggest factor in effective reduction of protection. We can have the best filtration fabric out there, but if the respirator does not fit close to the face and has breakage of seal, the air will find the path of least resistance and pretty much either escape out there or being sucked in there from the leakage point and not through the filter. And that's why there's so much attention to that fit testing and leakage problem to ensure respiratory protection for people who are in environments where there is a challenge, direct challenge to their health. So here is a little more information. I thought it might be interesting. On the right side, you see an informational brochure that is also on the CDC NIOSH website. So the fit testing procedure, there's the 005. You can search for that as a standard operating procedure in the NPPTL lab. It says isoamyl acetate test because that is safe, but can be smelled. I think, if I recall correctly, it smells like bananas. 18 subjects must be tested across a range of sizes from, let's say, small to extra large. And it's an 8-minute test with 2-minute activities, pretty much movement of the head and the body, because all of that will cause challenges to that seal of the mask to the face. And hopefully the mask is designed good enough to ensure that no breakage of seal exists and there's good protection to maintain their 95 protection level. So here is some additional information. As I mentioned, Steve Sharp did last week a great general filtration information session where I think some of the backgrounds were given in order to understand what is going on here. The N95s are technically highly effective filtration fabrics, but also those designs are highly engineered to make sure it meets all those criteria under all conditions, even while moving. And even then, there is plenty of documentation that it's still hard to maintain a 95% protection level. Usually, there's an electrolyte functionality added to the non-woven material to obtain the 95% levels of protection that are needed. Below, I provide 2 links. One is manufacturer information if you would want to go through that process, and a detailed certification information on the NIOSH and PPTL website is below. So then we move to the surgical masks. As I mentioned, no formal respiratory protection. The primary intention is different, although there are requirements for filtration of particles and aerosols. But the focus is on fluid resistance and splash protection primarily. As mentioned, it's subject to the pre-market approval, which means you need to collect the data and the proof of testing and testing certificate by third-party testing and submit your documentation to the FDA to show that substantial equivalency. If you've never dealt with the FDA, I advise you to get some help with somebody who's done it before. It does not necessarily have to be extremely complicated, but it's a process that you need to get familiar with to get that approval. The guidance for masks, and there's a separate one for gowns that I think Dr. King will go into, follow ASTM F2100 for basic testing. There's talk about surgical masks and medical masks. I will not go into these details too much. Medical masks are largely similar. The difference being that the requirements for surgical masks are slightly higher, specifically for their fluid resistance, but not as much different in terms of their filtration efficiency. Filtration efficiency of the fabric will be slightly higher for the surgical masks than the medical masks. So here are those is pretty much a copy of the documentation from the ASTM F2100 standard. Level 3 is the highest level here, so you can consider that as a surgical mask. It's a material filtration efficiency test. The material needs to show 98% efficiency against a material particular challenge that is slightly larger than the ranges I mentioned for NIOSH. It follows ASTM F2101. Therefore, for the material, it's slightly easier to reach those levels because the particles are higher than the 0.3 micron particle size I mentioned before. But similar to the N95 masks, it does not only provide requirements for protection, but also for breathing resistance, which is the second here, the differential pressure, but it's measured for according to EN 14683 NXC. That is a different methodology than ASTM D737, which you might be familiar with. You can convert back and forth, but pretty much the EN 14683 sets an airflow and measures the pressure, whereas the ASTM does it vice versa. It sets a 125 Pascal pressure and then measures the airflow that goes through your fabric sample. And then it does it in cubic feet per minute per square feet, whereas EN uses international units. So it's a little bit elaborate calculating back and forth, but they are related. In addition to bacterial filtration, it also looks at submicron particulate viral efficiency filtration. As you see here, 3 levels, or actually 2 levels only, 95, 98, and 98 for these very tiny particles. And as I mentioned, the resistance to penetration by synthetic blood, ASTM F1862, that is really the strict requirement at level 3, 160 millimeters mercury. It's pretty much a test cell where you have a liquid exposure on one end of the cell, and you measure underneath what will be pushed through at that 160 millimeters mercury pressure. So you try to assess how much pressure you need to exert before that synthetic blood that is slightly different in terms of viscosity and surface tension than normal water would be, but more relevant, obviously, to the hospital environment. So for the 160 millimeters mercury means a significant pressure to push any liquid through that fabric. So it has a very strong liquid repellent fabric. It still needs to be having a fairly low breathing resistance though. And obviously, as most textiles sold in the US, it needs to have a minimum requirement on flame spread and have not flammability. Flammability is important in a surgical environment because there's a fair amount of electrical equipment there. In the far past, fires in surgical rooms have existed, so the limited flammability of these products is really a relevant topic as well. That brings me to the last part, non-medical masks. And as the N95s are respirators certified and governed by NIOSH and PPTL, the surgical medical masks fall under FDA, the 510K process. Non-medical masks are not regulated by either the FDA or NIOSH. So there are no guidelines available. Obviously, these days, over the last 2 months, that has been a growing problem and challenge. Actually, yesterday, we've been working hard with a committee from various volunteers from various parts of the textile industry to try to get out a guidance document. As we are not officially a certification agency or have any federal support, it is a purely voluntary guidance document and not a formal specification or requirement, but we thought we should just give our best thoughts and consensus on that document. You see here a slightly simpler link than maybe in your handout. It actually just was uploaded this morning. So this new link, AHCC, who was part of this process, just put it up pretty much half an hour before this webinar. So I did not have time to change it. But the link that you have in your handout should also work. It's a basic designing guidance, provides some very limited guidelines to measure fabric protection and some guidance on how you could think about mask protection, a breathability requirement. And here I should probably have changed that. It's formally a requirement on a limited breathing resistance, There's always confusion on the term breathability because of people who only allow semi-permeable water vapor to go through also claim that to be breathable. Here we are really talking about fabrics that allow you to literally breathe through, which means they have a low air permeability and a high air permeability and a low breathing resistance, which is very different. There are some basic construction suggestions. Pretty much what you want to do if you're not using non-wovens is fabrics that are fairly dense, that have a slightly larger fuzz to it, so they have more microfiber content, that are able to block the pores that are generally much larger in normal textiles than they would be in the typical filtration non-woven fabrics. Different types of natural fibers and staple fibers could be used for that, but the document does give some initial suggestions as well. So that's pretty much what I wanted to cover with masks. Just general recommendations on personal protection, as we always give them in our TPAC center. Protection is not just about the fabric, but it's about the final product and how it fits the person and how it's being used by the person. If you don't use it well, your protection will also be negated. For masks, a filtration fabric plus good fit to the face is required to get that protection, and that is protection from the wear or the wearer from the outside, as well as protection of the environment of the wearer, if you want, the inside out, if you will. Air will generally follow the path of least resistance. If you feel air escape, that is also where most of the small particles will be going. Very large particles will be having inertia, so they'll go straight, but any small particle will actually go where the least resistance is going. And I try to go back here. I have a part here on the left side. Actually, I'm not sure you can see that because I don't have a good pointer here, but on the left side, you see a little smoke in that eye. I hope next week my colleague Brian Ormond will be able to show the video here where you can show that really if the fit is poor of these surgical masks, the air will just go up, and the smoke you see is also 1 micron or smaller particle size that is very similar to the things we're talking about here. So if your glasses fog up, your protection is low because pretty much the flow of air is going up through your mask but around it. Smaller particles will better and better flow the airflow and therefore find these little holes and go through them or around them. And the most penetrating particle size, as you've learned last week, is around 0.3 micron, and that is usually what that is tested. With that, I wanted to give it to my colleague, Martin King, to talk about surgical and non-surgical gowns and other aspects of medical textiles. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Emil. This is Martin here. And I'd just like to briefly overview the issues related to surgical and non-surgical gowns as a follow-up to what Emil has explained in some detail in terms of the requirements for face masks. So remember, now we're looking at a gown that is there to protect, and not as a filter, but to protect against primarily liquids. And so that's primarily the role of all these gowns for different levels of the liquid protection. And therefore, as you can see, there are a number of different gowns that are manufactured by different companies, and some of them are called surgical gowns, maybe isolation gowns, maybe a non-surgical gown or a cover gown, and so on and so forth. And the reason is, why are these needed? Why are different types of gowns needed? And so obviously within a medical healthcare environment, you need to be considering different roles that first responders and healthcare workers are exposed to. In other words, for example, if you are working in the surgery, an operating room, then around the patient with an open incision, there is a sterile field there, and therefore you need to be operating with a surgical gown that will prevent impact and liquid blood and other bodily fluids coming from the patient and penetrating through. So that's a protective gown in a very closely controlled environment in the operating room. But that's not necessarily where everyone in the operating room is located. And so there are other members of the operating room team who need to be protected, but not necessarily at the same level from liquid penetration, and therefore they can have a different level of protection, and those gowns can work equally well for them. Alternatively, if you think those of you who have given blood at a Red Cross or another blood collection center, you will know that there are people there who are giving and providing you with blood connections to their machinery, and they're providing you with a needle, and therefore there is, yes, some potential exposure to blood and other liquids, but basically for them it's not as serious and as a risky location, and therefore those gowns that they wear are not likely to be the same level of protection as you'd have inside the operating room. But then alternatively, if you think of a healthcare worker who's working at the triage of emergency and receiving people who are arriving in an emergency situation and maybe very ill and maybe have a bleeding and have other injuries, clearly you need to have an isolation gown that basically does protect you against all potential hazards. And therefore, in that respect, clearly there is another need for a type of gown for those workers that has other levels of protection, particularly though, again, as I said earlier, we're looking primarily at liquid and waterborne pathogens, whether they be bacteria or fungi or viruses, and to not be able to penetrate through those protective isolation gowns. So that's why there are a number of different types of gowns, and that's why they have different names. And basically what we'd like to be able to do today to some extent, and next in a couple of weeks time, is to explain a little more detail how you manufacture those and how you test for their particular compliance. So the next slide, Emil, we'll see the regulatory pathway in order to get such gowns approved. And first of all, let me indicate why is it that the FDA is involved in this particular procedure. And the FDA is there, in a sense, to protect everyone against misleading and inappropriate claims. And that's really what the regulatory pathway refers to here, is the fact that you are making a product and you associate with that product certain claims that it will serve in a medical or healthcare role. If it doesn't, if it's just a a bed sheet that doesn't have a healthcare or medical role, then it doesn't need to go through the FDA. But immediately you apply a claim that has a healthcare implication or a medical surgical implication of its function and its use, then all of a sudden it becomes an FDA issue, and you need to get it approved by the FDA. And there are a number of different ways of getting FDA approval, as Emil Den Hartog has explained earlier today. But for the most common way, I think, for a Class 2 gown, for example, is to use this 510K document. And as he explained earlier, likewise for a gown, if you want to manufacture a gown using the 510K approach, that means then there are equivalent or substantially equivalent gowns already out there on the market. And therefore what you need to demonstrate is that the functionality that you claim your gown can achieve is equivalent or substantially equivalent to those that are already on the market that have already been approved by the FDA. And therefore, okay, if they're substantially equivalent, then this is a no-brainer. Ours is equivalent to theirs and they're already on the market. Okay, then you can approve it. And so basically that's the thinking and of the procedure, but I appreciate as Dr. DeHartock said, the process is a little complicated, and it's something that you need to learn or have some technical advice or regulatory advice, I should say, to help you through the steps of in order to, first of all, identify the predicate product. That means which is the product already on the market that you are comparing against to demonstrate substantial equivalency. All right, so first of all, you have to identify that, and then you have to do a series of tests in order to demonstrate that, yes, the functionality that you're claiming is equivalent to that of the predicate device already on the market. And to be honest with you, that's not a difficult thing to do, but you are required to do the testing yourself and present the data to the FDA. The FDA doesn't do the testing. You do the testing, you go to an independent testing house or wherever you need to go to demonstrate that you have done this test and that the results are reliable and reproducible. If however, you have a new product that it's novel and innovative and there's nothing already out there on the market, then that does pose some additional challenges for you, because you have to use a different route to go through the FDA regulatory pathway. In other words, you're talking about a pre-market approval, PMN approach, and that is much longer and takes maybe several years in order to achieve. So I don't think we need to go there today with respect to our gowns, but basically that's another level of complexity if you're dealing with the FDA. So the FDA, a guidance document you can see is here, and you can download it, and you can see that in order to find that predicate device, that product that's already on the market, there are some guidance here as to help you find that and identify that particular product. Obviously, one needs to look not just at the initial properties at the time of sale, but also over the product life cycle. And therefore, there is sometimes requirements for testing after so many cycles of, if it's a reusable gown, for example, how many times has it been washed and laundered under certain conditions? And does it still maintain its still protective properties? And its resistance to blood penetration and liquid penetration after those number of washings. So there are these various requirements that you can read about in these various documents. Next slide, please. And so you can see here, again, we're providing you with advice on where to go to find more information about the process of maneuvering or stepping your product through the FDA process of the 510K, and what those tests will require, and how you need to look at. The FDA is also interested in, as Dr. DeHartock mentioned earlier, is interested in knowing what your production and manufacturing procedure is to make sure that is reliable and is consistent. And therefore, there are various validations that you need to do to make sure that process is valid. And once you have your product validated, you can imagine, yes, the FDA from time to time will come knocking on the door. They won't ask you, oh, when's a good time for us to come? They'll just show up and just to sort of review your manufacturing procedure. And also, actually, they're also interested in looking at your complaints file. So those types of things the FDA is concerned about, and those sorts of things are listed here in terms of what the FDA can do when it approves a product and needs to maintain the fact that this is a approved and regulated product. And the last two links here just refer to the issue of donning and doffing. In other words, putting on and taking off a gown. Remember, the gown is sterile when it comes out of its package, and you want it to remain sterile as you move into the operating room or into the place where you're going to be protected. And so there are particular procedures for doing that. And we'll talk more about those when we meet next in 2 weeks' time on June the 16th, when we'll have another webinar talking about surgical gowns and basic manufacturing principles and how we go about manufacturing them and packaging them, sterilizing them, and using them in a healthcare setting. I think that's pretty well, I think everything I have to say. Unless, Emil, you have other slides here referring to future webinars. So thank you for showing those.
Yes, thank you, Martin. I added your reference to your next webinar in 2 weeks on surgical gowns and manufacturing them, as well as my colleagues who will talk more about mask and respiratory protection and how to achieve that and evaluate that. But I think with that, we've said enough, and I'd like to give it open for any questions if there are there.
Yes, and thank you very much, Emil and Martin, for your presentation. Questions are rolling in as they do every week, so we'll just run through the list, get through what we can in about the next 10 or 12 minutes, and send the rest of the questions off to you for answering via email after the fact. So I'm just going to go back to the beginning chronologically. I have a question here that asks, these days we see KN95 masks as well. Is that different from an N95 mask?
Yes. Emil here, that is a great question. Thanks for that one. KN95 is a Chinese standard. The Chinese standard is different from the European and US standards. The problem with the so-called KN certified mask is twofold. One, the standard of the Chinese national body is different from the European and US standards, although not hugely different. So if they are truly, honestly certified to that standard, it may not necessarily be a problem, but you should always evaluate it against domestic standards here, the N95 US. However, unfortunately, in addition to that, there are also a huge amount of fake certificates that are being found. The EN and US standardization bodies have databases where you can see that if a so-called lab that certifies is indeed valid. For China, that is slightly different and harder to find sometimes. So it makes it, unfortunately, somewhat harder to determine if a certificate is actually correct or if it is a fake certificate that somebody just slapped on it. So that is why under people who are using N95s, KN95s need to be handled with caution and ideally should be tested before using. It's not by default that they're bad, but they need to be evaluated prior to use if they were to be used as an N95 mask.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, what are the key differences in testing process between ASTM F2100 and EN 14683?
The differences are not huge. I think they're similar. The breathing resistance is slightly different. The filtration particle size is slightly different. I think the 1489 is a range between 0.3 and 1 micron. But generally, the EN 14683 also has 3 classes. The FFP2 class is quite similar to the N95, and currently under the emergency use authorization, FFP2 mask from the EN 14683 standard can be used here as N95 masks as well, because the small differences there are sufficiently small.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is, ASTM 2101 is what size particle? For surgical respirators, does it need to meet ASTM 2299 as well as NIOSH requirements?
So the surgical masks are not a respirator, so it does not need to meet the NIOSH requirement. I think that's what's the question. The ASTM F2299, I think I went back to those slides. It's around 0.1 micron filtration efficiency. So it's smaller particles that should reflect virus particles. As they are smaller, it's not necessarily always that it is harder to filter against, as Steve has explained last week in the filtration efficiency testing. So that's one part. The second part, I think I answered first. Surgical masks do not need to follow the NIOSH standard because NIOSH is about respiratory protection.
Okay. And then the next question is, do seams in a face mask, e.g. down the front, present filtering flaws in regards to the material used? And if so, how best to mitigate them?
I think some of that would be, and I probably should defer to Dr. King because the same applies to gowns as well in terms of seams. But depending on the seaming technology, it could pose a risk if it's a normal seam with where the seaming thread has not been designed carefully and it's not done appropriately. It might create holes, and any hole in your fabric would kind of mitigate, would be a leakage point, and therefore mitigate or not mitigate, but prevent protection. But I'd like to defer also to Martin King to give him a chance in terms of gowns and medical textiles to see how seaming might also be relevant and how he will probably also address it in 2 weeks.
That's absolutely right, Emil. Thank you. Yes, seams are crucial components within the gown, and therefore just a regular sewn seam is not going to provide you the protection that you are expecting from the fabric. And therefore, you're right, you get leakage and there's potential for blood or other liquids to pass through. So there are a number of ways of overcoming that, and some people actually tape the seams. There are other ways of using ultrasonic seaming or thermal seaming. So yes, there are other ways of seaming without having a sewn seam that will cause holes in the fabric. And those are definitely issues that we were going to deal with in very particular format in 2 weeks' time when we talk about manufacturing gowns, because the seaming is a crucial component of that activity.
Okay, next question, and we've got 7 minutes left, so we'll just keep moving through. Could we have a reminder as to why the most penalizing particle size is 0.3 microns and not the smaller particles?
Yes, I should defer to our filtration experts, of course, but I think part of it is when you have smaller particles, they will start to behave more like air, and therefore air has a smaller particles and molecules have a diffusion characteristic to them. So they start to, if the airflow is not extremely high, they are more moving randomly back and forth, if you will, the Brownian motion in technical terms, which means they have a higher likelihood of actually hitting a fiber and be captured there. Whereas for larger particles, and it's a little more complex to that, so I really refer to last week's webinar on that. The larger particles are more slow. They will not follow the airflow streams as well, so they might be, because of their, they might go out of the corner, if you will, be captured by the particles, and they may be too big for the holes anyway. In addition to that, obviously, to really achieve this, we have the electric functionalization of the charge of the filter that helps additionally filter out those particles. But those two, the diffusion Brownian motion process, which is more effective for very small particles, and the more, let's say, capturing sieving effect of filters, and I hope Steve is not going to punish me for that one. For the larger particles, both of them have a minimum around 0.3 micron. And yeah, let's leave it at that for now.
Great. Next question. Can a company make a claim of N95 for a civil use non-medical respirator without NIOSH approval using independent laboratory test results? I've seen several companies doing so.
I'm not sure. I would not recommend doing that because it could be considered confusing and what's the term for that? But confusing marketing pretty much. So you create misinformation, if you will, in that way. N95 is specifically reserved to those N95 respirator masks and products, so they should be certified. Doing that, I would be extremely careful. I'm not in a law enforcement regulatory body, so I would not go after that at all. But I would just recommend anybody who would ask me, I would recommend to be extremely cautious and careful with that.
Okay. Next question. Is there a standard to sanitize and reuse an N95 mask since these are in short supply?
There is no standard there. That's one of the major problems. I think the fact that there are other types of products for respiratory protection that could also be used in the hospitals, like elastomerics, are getting more and more attention because these are designed and developed for reuse and cleaning. It's a very multifaceted problem in masks, is that the whole dynamics and economics in hospitals has developed against disposable masks because they are cheap and normally an easy and broad supply. There is not really a standard, nor is there an economy or procedures in hospitals for standard cleaning, washing of masks. Sterilization is the word I should probably use. So that is a big open problem, and I think in theory it could open the possibility for non-woven masks, if you will, based from other materials that are more durable and could be reused and sterilized. However, the whole infrastructure in hospitals is not set for that, so I would not be able to give a guarantee that after this pandemic is over, that hospitals would then keep using those and buying those masks, or they would just refer to what they know prior to the pandemic.
Okay, I'm going to give us one more question here since we're just about out of time. And this is chosen at random based on what's left here. Please address flammability testing for medical and surgical gowns. What specific test methods and what type of wash durability?
Martin, would you want to take this one?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I appreciate the question being asked, because the issue of flammability is one that you can test for when the gown is purchased and is first worn. The question is the flammability going to remain appropriate for the duration that it's used, if it's going to be reused on a number of occasions. So that's maybe an additional issue that needs to be addressed. The flammability standard is the same as for masks and other medical apparel related to testing, and it basically is appropriate, as Dr. Hartog said earlier, because in the operating room there are electric equipment that can be shorts. That often has been the use of alcohol and flammable solvents in the operating room that can create a fire. So in that respect, yes, clearly there is a minimum. It's not a particularly high standard to meet, and most materials that are being used for making masks will meet that particular standard. So it's not that we're not using cotton or cellulosics that burn very quickly or ignite quickly. Most of the materials obviously are synthetics, and they will tend to melt, and therefore the propagation rate is not particularly, or the ignition is not that easy. Therefore, the regular flammability test method can be used, and we'll be talking more about that on June the 16th when we talk about the way in which you test for the particular gowns of different protection levels.
Well, okay then, Emil, if you had anything you wanted to follow up there, you can go ahead. Otherwise, I can close it out.
Yeah, no, feel free to close it out. Thank you very much, Martin.
All right. Well, thanks again for everyone today for the great conversation, for the great questions that we were able to answer, and for the great questions that we will answer via text after this webinar is over. So a very special thank you to Emil and Martin for leading today's webinar. If you have any other questions about today's content, of course, feel free to follow up with us via email. A couple things that I want to say before we go. Registration is live for next week's webinar, Key Principles for Effective Protection with Masks and Respirators, led by Brian Ormond and I believe Mark Matthews of the Wilson College of Textiles. You can find it on our website, www.ifai.com/events. An email announcing registration for next week's webinar will also go out tomorrow. All webinars in the series will take place on Tuesdays at 12 noon Central through the end of the month. I also believe that webinars beyond next week's are open for registration on that website, ifai.com/events. So you can probably register for all the remaining in the series if you prefer. All right, well, once again, my name is Aaron Monson. I'm the Education and Events Manager here at IFAI, joined by the IFAI team, Janelle Wells-Berkeley, Megan Furl, and Annie Castle. Assisting with today's webinar is Melissa Sharp, Associate Director of the Zeiss Textiles Extension at the Wilson College of Textiles. As always, we're eternally grateful for Melissa's leadership on this webinar series. And once again, a thank you to our association sponsors, SEAMS, the Association and Voice of the U.S. Sewn Products Industry, ICP, Association Connecting Electronics Industries, and SPISA, the Sewn Products Equipment and Suppliers of the Americas. For more information about IFAI, our events, our member resources, our publications, and more, visit our website, ifai.com. Our 100th annual expo is November 4 through 6, 2020 in Indianapolis. Be on the lookout for a registration announcement that I believe went out just a couple hours ago. Registration is live, so check out our website, check out Expo, and sign up and come see us in November. And then lastly, a very brief 2-question survey will appear when you exit the webinar. Probably will take 30 seconds or less to fill out, so we hope that you will take a few moments to do that because your feedback helps us to continue to provide great content for you. All right, thanks again, everyone. We look forward to hosting you next week. Have a great afternoon.